enforce that rule very stringently starting today. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition, the time is now 3 o'clock, and we will finish at 4:30.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the light of the tragedy that happened in our province on Tuesday, early morning Tuesday, Nova Scotians are feeling, quite frankly, that the system has failed them, whether it is the justice system, Mr. Speaker, or whether it is the mental health system in this province on how we deal with Nova Scotia. So my question through you to the Premier is, how does an individual with significant history of violence get an unescorted, unsupervised day pass and release from custody?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as the Leader of the Opposition quite correctly said, it is was certainly a horrific set of events that occurred, and which we had an opportunity to speak about just earlier. What I can say is this. That the process for release is through the Criminal Code Review Board, which is a federally mandated board that complies with the provisions of the Criminal Code, and they make a determination with respect to the question of discharge.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians are asking this basic question. When you look at the history that is the accused, and you look at going back as recently as the fall of 2009, that the accused has been deemed not criminally responsible for his actions, and then some 8 months later, he's being released into the general population on a day pass. I think it's a legitimate question. I know that this process is being reviewed, and I want to ask the Premier, in that review, are we just looking at what's happened in the hours of Monday and Tuesday of this week, or are we actually reviewing the entire case that is associated with the release of this prisoner?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I would make one correction first, although it's a small one. I believe the individual in question was actually on a 1-hour pass. What we're going to look at is the whole question of the process, whether or not the provisions are adequate, whether or not they were followed, and as I mentioned, the actual provisions of law with respect to release are set out in the criminal code, and the requirements which the board must meet, therefore, are not a matter of our direct jurisdiction. The Leader of the Opposition may know that there's a handoff at that point that then hands the prisoner off for what is essentially a discharge planning process, and we intend to review that as well because it is a two-stage process.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
And I appreciate the Premier's correction. It was an hour pass, which turned into a much longer period of time. And my final question to the Premier, as we go through this process to try to discover what went so terribly wrong, are you and someone in your government now contacting the federal government to review the process that falls under their jurisdiction in order for this person to have been released into the community?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, reviews, to my knowledge, reviews of these provisions are routinely monitored by the federal government. In fact, I believe the provisions that are in place now are not actually that old. In the end, though, it comes down to a question of judgment that is exercised by the board. The board is made up of clinical practitioners. They're made up of lawyers. They receive risk assessments that are done by clinical practitioners who come before the board. Both the Public Prosecution Service and the individual are represented at that hearing. There is as I understand it, they're open to the public. So it's a transparent process. They hear all of the evidence and they make their decision based on the evidence that comes before them.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Justice. Last April, the Minister wrote an opinion piece for public consumption, announcing his department had a new disclosure policy, a new public disclosure policy that will guide the release of information to the general public in the event there was an incident involving the release of a person in the custody of the province. And I will table that opinion piece which lists the guidelines for such a release. In the case before us in the last 2 days, Mr. Speaker, the accused was a person in the care of the province who had been found not criminally responsible in the past, but nonetheless was a person who was potentially dangerous and was proven later to be dangerous to the community. My question to the Minister is this policy, is his policy that is used to deal with individuals who are in the care of the province also used for those on temporary passes from places like the East Coast facility who have been deemed not criminally responsible but who are nonetheless dangerous?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I assume my colleague will understand that I'll not talk about the particular case as that's now before the courts, but what I will talk about is about the policy and the procedure. And we announced today that we will be doing a review and having a review. I'm in partnership with the Minister of Health, and that we are going to have a statement back by 30 days from now to talk about where the policies and procedures follow, and at that point to determine whether they're adequate and what direction we need to go. The particulars behind someone in our institutions, the security is taken seriously, and I'm very confident that at the forensic facility that there's adequate security there. And the process will review how events unfolded.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the answer, and I was, in fact, attempting to ask only about the policy, and so in supplementary I will ask the Minister, according to his own policy, which I have and will table for the benefit of the House, the Minister's Department will issue a public advisory or a news release where it's believed there may be a danger to public safety. I'd like to ask the Minister, what factors does he consider when deciding whether a person is in fact a danger to public safety, and would he consider a release in the case of a person who has been found not criminally responsible a potential danger to public safety?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to start my answer off by saying that the whole issue around Mr. Tavel's passing is a sad one, and that our feelings and thoughts go out to the family, and I know some of his friends are here in this House, and to the community at large, because it's not just his friends and his family that are affected. This issue has affected the community as a whole. I want to reinforce my respect for the criminal code and for the policies and procedures that are there. There's some very clear lines of what the process is and what we must adhere to. If somebody is found not criminally responsible for something, there has to be a mechanism for them to come back into society until there's such a point where it's deemed that the person should never return to society. So that balance and the difficulty where we sit, and I'm responsible for the safety and security of all Nova Scotians, and I take that seriously, is that we have to balance that interest of individual rights of someone and the public safety. And so in the review that we're carrying on, I'm very confident that we'll have a better understanding what happened in the particular case that's before us. At the same time, look and examine the overall and seeing if they were adequate or if changes need to be made. And we will be very diligent and very prudent on that process.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. According to media reports, the accused murderer of Raymond Tavel had a long history with police, including a number of charges that most Nova Scotians would consider to constitute a danger to public safety. I'd like to ask the Minister, how many times has the public been notified under his new policy instituted last April about an at-large person who has been found not criminally responsible but is nonetheless at large?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much. One of the balancing steps that needs to occur here is that when someone moves from a criminal forum to the issue of mental health or health issues, this is an issue of mental health and whether someone is being re-engaged with society in the process. There's a very clear line process that's there. One of the things that we want to do in our review, as I stated, is that we want to examine were the policies and procedures followed, and when we get those answers, were they adequate at this time? So it's very important that we respect the privacy of individuals, that we respect the rights, and we have to balance public safety with that. And that's one of the difficulties in a democratic and free society, is to have those options. And remember that if we're dealing with mental health, we know that it's a very complex and serious matter, and that we need to be focused on the issues.
The Honourable Member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians today are looking for answers. While we cannot expect the government can control random acts of violence, we have to ask how someone who was under the care and custody of the province of Nova Scotia was allowed out on an unescorted pass with such a violent past in their history. Nova Scotians are asking how Mr. Denny was allowed to leave the East Coast Forensic Hospital in Burnside. My question to the Minister of Justice is, can he advise the House and all Nova Scotians who exactly made the decision to allow Mr. Denny to leave the Forensic Hospital on an unescorted pass?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The process, there's a very defined process under the criminal code that's followed. Once the individual is deemed by the committee that they can have a pass, the final stage goes, as I understand the process, to the healthcare professionals of the institution and examine. There's many factors, as I'm learning, that go into the decision making, and to the level of care that is put into it is quite intense. And in this situation here, there is a 1-hour pass issued. I respect the decision and I respect the processes. In that vein, I also want to reiterate the fact that we are doing a complete review. We're looking at policies and procedures, and once we have that, we have to determine were they adequate. And I think my job and my role here is to step back, examine all the facts and situations. I also have to balance the fact that a person is innocent until proven guilty. That's an ingredient that I have to keep out there and respect. At the same time, I am very sensitive and caring about the loss of life and how that has traumatized our province.
The Honourable Member for Richmond on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, we're once again left in a situation where the Minister of Justice is reacting to an incident rather than being proactive. Mr. Speaker, all Nova Scotians and this government in particular are aware of several incidents where we have seen mistaken releases, unlawful escapes, and administrative errors in our justice system. I've risen in my place several times as justice critic, expressing the concern and the fear that if these problems were not corrected, the safety of innocent Nova Scotians would be put at risk. My question is, will the Minister of Justice advise what safety protocols were in place prior to the approval of Mr. Denny's unescorted leave?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for that question. I want to assure all Nova Scotians that the security and safety at the forensic unit and at the Burnside Correctional Facility are top-notch, and I have all the confidence in that process and procedure. What we have here is a process where individuals that are deemed to be not criminally responsible due to their mental illness. We are dealing with a disease and with an illness that we have to respect the professionals that we hire, that we put in place to monitor. It's separate from government so that government influence isn't interfering with what we see as an arm's length responsibility. At the same time, as Minister of Justice, I have to take public safety and say, how do we balance that? And remember at all times that we're in a democratic, free society, and we have to balance those interests, and I take them all seriously. I welcome the questions, and I look forward to the overall findings that we have to make sure that if there's improvements need to be made to the system, that we make them timely.
The honourable member for Richmond on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the suspect in this case has a history of violence and was entrusted to the care and custody of our justice system. Nova Scotians are again asking why Mr. Denny was granted an unescorted pass from the East Coast Forensic Hospital. The government has announced today a review is taking place, but we have to wait 30 days to find out the results of those review. So my final question is, what immediate steps is the Minister of Justice taking to ensure the safety of those in the care and custody of our province, along with all Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have the utmost confidence in the professionalism of the staff at the Burnside Correctional Facility and at the forensic unit. I also have the utmost confidence and respect for the professionals that are on the committee that examines each and every case. And as Attorney General, I must respect those processes. I do respect those processes, and I allow the system to go its course. And I look forward to any findings we may get in examining the policies and procedures to see whether they were appropriate and adequate and were they followed.
The honourable member for Richmond on a new question.
Mr. Speaker, we've been advised that 3 people were granted temporary unescorted passes from the East Coast Forensic Hospital on Monday, and none of the 3 apparently returned on time. We understand that 1 eventually returned. Another, Mr. Denny, was apprehended by police and now faces criminal charges. But as of last night, we are told that the 3rd is still missing. I'm wondering if the Minister of Justice could advise all Nova Scotians and this House whether the 3rd individual has been apprehended.
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
I don't have that answer. That's information that's coming forward. We will get that and get it back to the member and before the end of the day.
The honourable member for Richmond on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Premier says a health question. Minister of Justice could easily have referred it to the Minister of Health to provide a response. He chose instead to say that he doesn't know whether the individual in question is still missing from the facility or not. Mr. Speaker, we heard the Justice Minister explain the protocols that are in place. However, it seems that there's some holes in that system. We know that the best indicator of future violence is past violence, and we know that the person now facing charges was under the government's care in the justice system. Mr. Speaker, the protocols involved by the Minister of Justice clearly indicate that there is a need for notification. So my question to the Minister of Justice, when 3 individuals under the care and custody of the East Coast Forensic Hospital failed to return from their unescorted passes, what warnings were issued to police and to the public?
Honourable Minister of Justice.
Because it's dealing with that aspect of it, I will turn that over to the Minister of Health to answer.
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I understand the confusion. This matter is very complex. It's complex because we're not dealing with people in custody. We're dealing with patients in a hospital. And their care falls under the jurisdiction of the Department of Health when they're patients in the forensic hospital, when they have been found by the board to be not criminally responsible, and they in fact have had their offenses, they've been discharged with certain conditions. With respect to the 3 individuals, I am not aware that there were 3 individuals that went AWOL, but I am aware that there were 2 individuals that went AWOL, and it's my understanding that the police were notified within the 15 to 20-minute period that is kind of a grace period that's given when they had not returned to the hospital within the required period of time. But as we have indicated, we have procedures in place. We have initiated the review process to look at whether or not those procedures were followed, including the procedures for notifying the police in the time that is required, and with a view to saying whether or not the procedures were followed, and if they weren't followed, why not? And if they were followed and we still have this terrible tragedy, what can be done to strengthen our procedures?
The honourable member for Richmond on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Justice made it clear yesterday that while the admittance and discharge of individuals at the East Coast Forensic Hospital fell under responsibility of the Department of Health, while they're at the facility, they are under his care and control and his responsibility. So we're going by what the Minister of Justice has told us. The Minister of Justice has indicated that there is a policy for that facility of notifying the public when there are significant incidents, or notifying, especially in the cases where someone either is wrongfully dismissed or unlawfully escapes or is discharged temporarily and does not return. Nova Scotians are rightfully asking today, once an individual who was granted a 1-hour pass did not return, why were Nova Scotians not made aware of this? So I understand the Minister of Justice talking about privacy. We all respect that. But at the same time, when you are told you have a 1-hour pass and you do not return, you give up your rights to privacy, and that's when Nova Scotian safety has to become the underlying concern for this government and for this minister. So I would ask the minister again, if it's not him or the Minister of Health, why were Nova Scotians not advised that 2 or 3 individuals under the care and custody of this government did not return to the facility after their 1-hour pass had expired?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I will answer that. In this circumstances here, if I can point out to the member that there's 2 aspects to the forensic unit. There is one chamber that deals with individuals that are under secure custody. There's the other that's in the process where they are part of the health area that are subject to day passes, to hourly passes, and once they don't return, there's a policy in place which was followed. The police were notified. And that's where we're at. At that point, that we would assess in the future on incidents that go beyond a certain point, and if there's any indications that the person presents a threat, that would be addressed at that time. Thank you.
The honourable member for Inverness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Justice, but if the responsibility more falls under the Minister of Health, I'm happy if he refers the question. We've been asking some questions about what has been happening, and my question is about the release of individuals from the East Coast Forensic Unit. Now, we presume that there has to be some period of model behavior before they're given some kind of a pass to leave the facility, and it may be a temporary pass. My question, what is the process that leads to the release of individuals from the East Coast Forensic Unit, and what steps are taken to monitor their actions after release for the safety of our public, and with particular respect to those who have had a history of violent activity?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
I will refer that component because that's the health issue dealing with a patient with mental illness. Over to the
Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, and I do thank the honourable member for the question. I do recognize that it is a confusing situation. We have 2 units over in Burnside. We have the East Coast Psychiatric, Forensic Psychiatric Hospital. And in this hospital, we have a unit for people. For example, the accused today is in a unit because the individual has faced new criminal charges, and a determination will have to be made with respect to that individual's capacity around this. People who have had assessments and have been determined not to be criminally responsible for their actions are in a different unit where they receive treatment and gradual reintegration back into the community. Those individuals are patients, and the policies that are worked with are patient-oriented. They're based on clinical decisions by a treatment team of psychiatrists and others. These are the people who make decisions around leaves from the unit, the extent of the leaves, the conditions under which leaves will be granted.
The honourable member for Inverness on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, and again, I think this will go back to the Minister of Health. Nova Scotians, I believe, want a process in place that works to protect both patients and the public. Can the Minister advise how many Nova Scotians are now on temporary release or perhaps on some type of longer-term release after a finding of being not criminally responsible for a violent activity, so that we might have an understanding of how many people may be out there on leaves who may have had this past violent history?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I don't have actual numbers today. This is a question that I myself have asked to the Capital District Health Authority and the head of the forensic unit. The response that I've received is that in some ways this changes almost day by day. People can be remanded to the facility through the courts on a daily basis. In addition to that, the review board, the criminal review board, may meet and have a disposition with respect to an individual. That means that the person is transferred from one unit to another. There may be a number of people who are out right now on passes, having been successfully integrated over a gradual process into the community. So the numbers are fluid and will require a period of time to compile them. But I have made the request to get the information so we can provide that to the public, have a greater reassurance to the public that in spite of this horrific circumstance, there are many people with mental illnesses who are being very successfully reintroduced back into our community through a process that's managed.
The honourable member for Inverness on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I believe that those found not criminally responsible for crimes committed must become the responsibility of the system that releases them from that responsibility. Not so long ago, we had the loss of life in my own constituency of a gentleman at the hands of an individual with a history of mental illness and violent behavior. And I say mental illness, but I'm always careful to say that because I know there's many people who suffer from mental illness that would never do anything like this. But this particular individual was obviously troubled. He had a checkered past and run-ins with the law and violent behavior. So my question, Mr. Speaker, will the minister, and this may be more appropriate, well, I guess it will be for the Minister of Health if it's more appropriate. Will the minister conduct a provincial review of the process now used for the release of individuals so that we can hopefully prevent these kinds of things from happening in the future?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you. And Mr. Speaker, I believe that what we announced earlier before we came into question period is precisely that type of review that the member is requesting. It's a review that will look at the existing procedures. It will look at whether or not they were followed. It will look at whether or not they are adequate, and if found to be inadequate, what could be done to strengthen the procedures. Thank you.
The honourable member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Health has confirmed that at least 2 individuals who had been granted passes on Monday evening failed to return to the East Coast Forensic Hospital once their pass had expired. The media is reporting a 3rd individual, which we will await for the Minister to confirm whether that's the case or not. I'm wondering if the Minister of Health could advise the House today whether Monday night was the first time that individuals on passes from the East Coast Forensic Hospital failed to return once their pass time had expired.
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and without a doubt, it's probably not the first time, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Richmond on his first supplementary.
Well, obviously, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians will be asking the question of how prevalent is this and what steps are in place, especially now when we're talking about reviewing protocols. If this was not the first time this has happened, one has to ask why were protocols not put in place to ensure a more stringent system. I would like to ask the Minister again whether, in light of these incidents, if she could advise all Nova Scotians in this House whether any individual that was on a escorted or unescorted pass from the East Coast Forensic Hospital has been found to have gotten in trouble with the law while out on their pass.
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and certainly I'm not aware of any incidents that the member is referring to.
The honourable member for Richmond on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure the Minister knows that is certainly information we'll all be hoping to receive and that it will be part of the review as well. The question becomes here as well, how is the decision made whether a pass is escorted or whether it is unescorted? And the question here is, with an individual with such a violent past, why was there not some form of an escort? I'm wondering if the Minister could advise to us whether she has any data as to how many escorted passes are issued versus unescorted passes, and at the same time, who exactly would escort an individual if it is determined to be an escorted pass.
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much for the question. The information I have is certainly that it is routine for patients who are in the forensic hospital who have been discharged in terms of the reintegration back into the community that they receive passes. And there is a variety of passes into the community that's available to them. The 1 hour pass is the minimum kind of pass, unescorted, but there are as well escorted passes that occur. But for an individual to go by themselves, 1 hour is the minimum, and they can be much longer than that. They can be an overnight, they could be a weekend, they could be for holiday, you know, a long weekend or whatever, depending on the clinical assessment, the judgment of the clinicians that are involved in treating those patients.
The Honourable Member for Argyll.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question as well will be to the Minister of Health. This morning on CBC, a doctor indicated that there are many clients, as the Minister just said, of the East Coast Forensic Unit that are on unescorted passes each day. So my question is, though, on this subset of maybe of those who, on average, have been found not criminally responsible relative to the acts of violence, how many of those people might be out there on a regular basis?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And really, I have no information that kind of delineates people who have had a history of of some type of aggression from people who have had a history of performing crimes that are victimless, let's say.
The honourable member for Argyll on his first supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and to the minister. I thank you for that, because I know it's a difficult situation and extremely complicated. The concern, though, we have as well, though, that media has been reporting that there was 3 clients of the unit failed to return to the unit at their scheduled times on Tuesday. And I know that the minister didn't necessarily have the information available, but I was wondering maybe that as soon as she has it, that she could share that information later on today or tomorrow.
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And what I would say, Mr. Speaker, is this. I want members to be mindful that while this is I know of paramount concern to us all, we have to continue to remember that the individuals who are in this facility are patients. And they are patients in a healthcare setting receiving treatment. And those decisions have been made by a board that has information in front of it that I don't have and that members here don't have. I want to remind people that we have patients in other facilities around the province who go on leaves from hospital and healthcare facilities, and sometimes they don't return at the appointed hours, and we don't put media advisories out, and we don't publish the information. So we need to be very mindful of how we approach this, because in these cases we're not talking about criminals who have been found to be criminals, who are incarcerated in the justice system. We are talking about people who are mental health patients, who are in a hospital and are receiving treatment. And there is a distinction that I would ask members to be mindful of.
The Honourable Member for Argyll on his final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And no, I completely understand the distinction between the two. The concern that we have, though, is that media has been reporting that there were 3 clients. So maybe what I'll ask the minister to provide, at her earliest convenience. It's not something that I think she can provide to us right now, but maybe a cumulative of hours of all patients on unescorted passes with a history of violence that maybe have been absent beyond the time permitted to be out. Just to have, it's not that we're worried, but it'd be a good idea just to have an idea how relevant this might be.
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, and I want to genuinely thank the member for the question, because I know what he's trying to get at, and I totally support our need to be able to do 2 things that have some tension between them. We need, in the light of what has occurred, to be able to reassure the public with respect to public safety. But we also need to be able to, at the same time, reassure the public, and particularly people in the mental health field, of our commitment to human rights, to patient rights, and to the appropriate care of people with mental health disorders. And that is the balance that we all will try to find as we go through what is an extremely important and significant issue. And I welcome questions and suggestions on how we can improve the system that we have in place for people as well as the public at large.
The Honourable Member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, many Nova Scotians have become accustomed to waiting long periods of time for assessing health care services, but no wait, Mr. Speaker, has been longer than the wait for the mental health and addiction strategy. Promised 2 years ago by this government, deadlines have gone by and subsequently extended. To this day, we keep hearing about the great promise of the strategy from the Minister of Health and Wellness, yet no firm date has for its release. My question to the Premier: why has it taken over 2 years for this government to produce a mental health and addiction strategy?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the member opposite for the question. As he would understand, and as we have said before in this House, this is not an easy matter to deal with. The simple fact of the matter is that as we've watched, while the federal government has been more restrictive in its attitude toward funding federal health matters, we have struggled with how that strategy into the future is going to be funded, among other things. But we are calling upon professionals in the mental health community for advice. We are working diligently to ensure that we have the best possible strategy in place, and I'm sure there'll be a follow-up question on this. I'm sure at that point I'll be able to refer it to the Minister of Health, who will give even a more illuminating answer.
The honourable member for Kings West on his first supplementary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Premier for encouraging me to keep moving in this direction. Mr. Speaker, we have seen mental health program changes happen right across this province, whether it be the changes to the IWK Act and Compass programs, or an announced closure of a Capital District 28-day residential treatment for adults with addictions. All of these changes have occurred in a vacuum without a strategy to guide them. We have seen the cyberbullying task force appointed, the report completed, and delivered to government. A report that stresses the issue of cyberbullying and mental health issues in children and youth cannot and should not be dealt with in silos. My question to the Premier: how can all of these changes be happening when you have yet to announce a mental health and addiction strategy?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the reality is that the Department of Health and Wellness is, in fact, the needs that have to be met in mental health are not. They're not secrets. There have been gaps in mental health for a number of years that we have recognized, and we are looking at how we bridge those gaps in a common sense kind of way. The changes that you talk about, in fact, were designed to do just exactly that. It was not designed to take existing resources and to apply them more effectively to ensure that more people got better access to care, and that's a sign of a government that understands the needs of the mental health community and are simply working hard to make sure they get met.
The honourable member for Kings West on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, program changes and recommendations from other strategies are one thing. Continued human suffering by those with a mental illness, the anguish of family members watching their family members attempt to seek treatment only to have services not available are quite another, and often having to desperately move to private help. We have seen 2 incidents in Halifax over the last few days, one a robbery and overdosing involving prescription drugs, and one involving the murder of a well-loved community leader. These should be a wake-up call that a well-coordinated, well-funded, robust mental health strategy is needed, and it's needed now. My question to the Premier: when can Nova Scotians expect this government to release its 2-year-in-the-making mental health addiction strategy? What is the date, Mr. Premier?
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to respond to the member opposite. I would like to refer this to the Minister of Health, and perhaps she can update the member.
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Premier for the question. Mr. Speaker, it is true that I anticipated that the mental health strategy would have been completed in September. The advisory group requested an extension back in the fall, which I gave them, Mr. Speaker. There was some commissioned research that had only become available in the fall that they wanted to examine and consider. before they issue their report. And so there was that extension. And what I anticipate is that we will have the mental health strategy fairly soon, sometime this spring. So it isn't 2 years late. It was never, the work began 2 years ago, and it was anticipated that the strategy would have been here in the fall. It is about 6 or 8 months behind schedule, but there are very valid reasons for that, and I'm looking forward to having the recommendations of the working group and then to be able to respond in terms of implementing a strategy. Mr. Speaker, I do want to indicate that that hasn't meant that we have sat on our laurels. We've done a lot with respect to expanding mental health services. We've expanded the mental health crisis mobile unit here in Capital 24/7. We've fully funded treatment for children with autism. We've opened a psychiatric intensive care unit, the first in the province. We've reformed access to children's and mental health at the IWK, and we've moved the forensic service for kids to Waterville.
The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, my question to you will be to the Minister of Community Services. Mr. Speaker, with each situation that arises within the Department of Community Services, we see the Minister's lack of judgment and understanding of her position. Mr. Speaker, the most recent situation highlights the Minister's questionable judgment when she published a confidential report on Talbot House, a report that was riddled with suggestive allegations against Father Abbas. Mr. Speaker, the Minister told reporters yesterday that she did not feel she owed Father Abbas an apology because she had not accused him of anything. And Mr. Speaker, I'll table that. Mr. Speaker, her actions are reprehensible. These allegations were found to be baseless and false well before the Minister published the report. My question to the Minister of Community Service through you, sir, is this. Will the Minister admit that her rush job on publishing the report with only a note asserting Father Abbas' innocent was morally wrong and unfair?
Honourable the Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is that the review was an organizational review. It was a review of the board, and it was not an individual review whatsoever without any accusations in there. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cape Breton West on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in addition to the Minister's obvious disregard, she shows us time and time again that she is simply not up to her job. Mr. Speaker, yesterday, Father Abbas released a statement in which he expressed his disappointment with the matter of the review conducted by the Department of Community Services. And Mr. Speaker, I will table that as well. Mr. Speaker, the parents of East Preston Daycare expressed their disappointment and their outrage with the department's arrogance surrounding their protections of an alleged pedophile. My speaker through you, Mr. Speaker, is this. How many more Nova Scotians does the Minister have to fail before she realizes she is so caught up in the processes of her department that she has lost sight of her overriding responsibility, and that is to protect those that are in her care?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, I dedicate myself each and every day to the welfare of Nova Scotians. There's a long list of things that I've done, and this department and this government has done to proven that. I have provided the facts, and the facts are the facts are the facts. And if they cannot accept those facts, that is not an issue that I can deal with. Thank you.
The Honourable member for Cape Breton West on his final supplementary.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And it's obvious there are many things that this minister can't deal with. Mr. Speaker, as a parent, I know that the minister can understand the fear and anguish that parents as children of the children at the East Preston Daycare must have felt. I know I can feel it. when the media revealed that the tremendous risks their children were facing, yet the minister didn't act. Mr. Speaker, with Talbot House, she acted swiftly and without any regard for the effect her actions would have on Father Abbas. Her department sprayed suggestive, discredited allegations on the internet. Mr. Speaker, the board of directors at Talbot House, people who are well respected in our community, specifically asked the department not to publish the report until the errors were corrected. If the department couldn't wait, they asked that their responses be posted as well. The minister ignored them and beat them to the punch. Mr. Speaker, my question, after all these morally wrong actions by her department, will the minister at least agree to attach clarification of Father Abbas's innocence to the report?
Of Community Services.
Once again, Mr. Speaker, that review was an organizational review. I would invite the member to read it, and then he will see that there was no specific individual accusations in there whatsoever. But once again, that member and that party lives and breathes misinformation, and that is the issue here, is to try to gain political points on the emotions of individuals in our communities, and that's very sad.
The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the clock is ticking, and each and every day that passes produces disruption in healthcare facilities within Capital District and throughout Nova Scotia. Patients are being transferred now, today, not 1 week from today. Patients who had been waiting for surgery and thought they would get it next week are being told they will have to wait even longer, and those who thought they were next and will also wait longer. Given this government's supposed concern about wait times, what, if any, proactive measures has the Premier taken to get both parties back to the collective bargaining table?
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to indicate to the member opposite that, of course, we're very concerned with the fact that we're into a countdown situation toward a strike in the Capital District. I want to assure him that we are making every effort possible to get the parties back to the table. This is a difficult part in the bargaining process, difficult for everyone involved. The consequences are, of course, of considerable gravity. We certainly understand and appreciate that, but please be assured that we're doing everything we can to encourage them to get back to negotiations.
The honourable member for Kings West on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, here's the reality. According to Capital District, no talks have been scheduled this week. A significant amount of time is being spent on the part of the Capital District trying to rearrange services so fewer patients are and will be served, when wait times are telling us we need to be doing the exact opposite. Given that the government is the ultimate employer, why has the Premier been sitting on the sidelines when our healthcare system throughout Nova Scotia is experiencing such upheaval?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to assure the member opposite that that's not the case. We are very much engaged. It does take work to get people back to the table. It doesn't happen easily. We are taking every opportunity to encourage that to happen. But when the member stands up next time to ask a question, maybe he would set out what his suggestion is.
The honourable member for Kings West on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it is not enough for government to wish and hope that both parties get back to the bargaining table. They must play a leadership role, and acknowledge that at the end of the day, they are the employer, given that the best option for patients is to see its government negotiating now, not 1 week from now, and the best deal for taxpayers can best be settled at the bargaining table through robust collective bargaining negotiations between employees and employer. When can we expect the Premier to play a leadership role, get both parties back to the bargaining table for the sake of patients and taxpayers of this province?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I did note that the member opposite had no, of course, suggestion of his own. But, Mr. Speaker, we are displaying exactly that kind of leadership by encouraging them to get back, to engage in, as he put it, robust collective bargaining. This, of course, is I suppose, an unexpected and a very helpful change from when, of course, the Liberals were in power, when they simply rolled back wages, paid 1,000 nurses to leave the profession, closed 1,500 hospital beds.
The honourable member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In May of 2011, a year ago almost, Dr. Wayne McKay was asked to lead a task force on cyberbullying. This was in response to an ongoing problem facing our youth. One of the key recommendations in that report was to appoint an anti-bullying coordinator who would oversee the implementation of the actions by the government in response to the report. The coordinator was to be in place as soon as possible, no later than the end of 2011-12 school year. At the time, the minister dismissed this recommendation, reporting to the Chronicle Herald on March 22nd that her department already had people in place to do the job. In question period on April 11th, I asked the minister who in the department had been given the responsibility to coordinate this initiative, and as per expected, the minister did not have an answer. In her statement today, she once again speaks to a, quote, dedicated person to oversee the development and implementation. So my question to the minister, who is the person?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As I have said very clearly, we're not adding another level of bureaucracy, but we are definitely going to be hiring a person dedicated to this service. It will be an anti-bullying coordinator that we will have at the Department of Education. There will be a competition for this job, and the department is in the stage of having that, what criteria we would like to have in place. We're looking for a person we're looking for a person that not only has the skills, also the passion and to bring to this job. So we will have that job posted, which we're looking at people within government and within school boards. It will be posted in May.
The honourable member for Colchester North on her first supplementary.
Thank you. On the same date, Mr. Speaker, April 11th, during the same question period, the minister was asked a question regarding the timeline for implementing the recommendations in the report. Once again, the minister was unable to identify a timeline, going to her favourite response, soon, very soon. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, we've seen the sad results from bullying, and yet the minister can do nothing better for the timeline than soon, very soon. So my question to the minister, will she share with members of this House her timeline for implementation?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The implementation of the action plan is going to be done through with the anti-bullying coordinator. There's many recommendations that were brought forward. We have started that work. We've laid down the foundation. We're moving forward within the department. And actually, I would like to add, not just within the department, but many departments are involved in looking at ways that we can remedy this situation. But it will be the anti-bullying coordinator's job to work with our stakeholders and our partners as we develop a plan as we move forward. We want to make sure that the action we put in place is going to be action that actually benefits our students. Thank you.
The honourable member for Colchester North on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday in this House, the minister tried to defend the merits of taking literacy money out of the classroom and buying lunch bags for 4-year-olds. That's $500,000 in the next 3 years. The minister talks about limited resources and setting priorities. The minister, Mr. Speaker, has a choice of where to spend that $500,000. It could be to purchase lunch bags or of trinkets for 4-year-olds, or it could be to begin the implementation of recommendations designated are designed to protect our students from bullying and to make our schools safe. So my question to the minister, which of these is your priority? Her priority.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The overall well-being of every student in our system is paramount. As a public school system, there are many components of our education program that need to be taken care of. Now, I would like to stand on record that it is not fair to name a resource that's going in the hands of our youngest students, an investment in the hands of our youngest students, as a lunch bag. It is these are resources that coming from the work with the early intervention teachers in our province, and recognizing this as resources that enable families to engage in literacy activities. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, at the recent New Brunswick NDP convention last week in St. John, newly minted federal leader Thomas Mulcair came out firing against shale gas exploration. And I would like to read a quote that he made to CBC. Mr. Mulcair goes on to say, these are families that have been on the same land and farmed the same land, not just for generations, but for centuries in some cases. So people are very close to their land, and they don't want to see it destroyed by carpetbaggers coming in from other places to make a quick buck, who leave the mess for future generations to clean up. There will be no sustainable wealth created here, and they'll leave the cleanup to New Brunswickers. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister of Energy is that does he concur with the message that the newly federal NDP leader has and the characterization of the companies that do these practices?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question. I certainly respect the leadership of Mr. Mulcair and the opportunity that he's given to Canadians to make an informed decision. But this government here has never, ever approved hydraulic fracturing. We take the seriousness of the communities around drinking water and groundwater, and we've undertaken a review in both the Department of Energy and in the Department of the Environment, and that review still needs more good information, so we're going to make an informed decision after we gather all the information that's available out there to us.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North on his first supplementary.
With the joint announcement by the Departments of Energy and Environment on April 16th to extend the review for hydraulic fracturing to mid-2014, a review that was due out weeks from now, it has led many Nova Scotians to be concerned again with the NDP government and this minister putting off another report that is key to the future of the environment of this province. Mr. Speaker, can the minister explain to the House why his government has pushed the report into the future? Was it simply to gather more information, or the fact that Triangle Petroleum is now speaking out in frustration and is threatening to pull out of Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Certainly the last thing we want to see is any harm to our environment or to our drinking water. That's why we've undertaken this review at this time. And we know there's a number of reports out there from the Environmental Protection Association, Environment Canada, and in jurisdictions such as New York and Quebec and New Brunswick and so on. Good, valuable information that we need in order to make the right decision for Nova Scotians.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, with Triangle Petroleum threatening to hand the lease back to the province and make a complete exit, can the Minister of Energy ensure the House and all Nova Scotians that if indeed Triangle pulls out, he will ensure that they return the pristine lands they have disrupted, be returned to their original state, and that the cleanup not be a burden to the taxpayers of Nova Scotia?
The Honourable the Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said before, we're not going to approve any hydraulic fracturing during the period of this review. We'll continue to work with the proponents out there, including Triangle Petroleum and others, as we have been doing over the last number of months. And I understand that they have been issued an order to clean up any sites there in the Hants County area, and they are required to comply, and I'm sure they will. But I'll repeat again, we're not going to allow hydraulic fracturing until the review is finished.
The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on April the 11th, the Minister of Education announced in a release that she was allocating money, and I quote, a new small school isolated schools supplement. The problem is, Mr. Speaker, that there is no new money in this supplement, and what she was really announcing was simply a change in branding. My question to the Minister, will the Education Minister confirm that there is no new money in this supplement?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much. through our funding formula, there is an allocation going out for small isolated schools, which I have had the opportunity to explain during estimates that this government recognizes that schools that are small, especially our small high schools and isolated schools, come with an extra cost to school boards. So it's included in the formula. Under the other formula, there were 44 schools identified. Under the new formula, there are 98 schools within the province of Nova Scotia that do receive some extra funds to their boards to support them with the small isolated schools. Thank you.
The honourable member for Kings West on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, this rebranding was announced on April the 11th. We are hearing quite clearly from school boards that this announcement does nothing to change their bottom line. With no new money in this supplement, the schools are still facing the same cost pressures. This is as much of an attempt at rebranding as it was the name change of the IEF. Mr. Speaker, fancy slogans are not going to keep rural schools from closing. My question to the Minister, will the Minister explain to rural Nova Scotia communities how a rebranding exercise with no new money will keep their schools from closing?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much. I guess I will have to disagree with the member about the funding around this. We recognize that small schools, especially small high schools and isolated schools, do come at an extra cost to school boards. So it's included in the funding formula, and that envelope of money is provided to those school boards that have those schools that are small high schools, small schools, and isolated schools. There are 98 schools now that have been identified, and the envelopes of money have gone to each of the school boards. Thank you.
The honourable member for Kings West on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, obviously, it's nothing new that the minister would disagree with school boards who see no change in their bottom line. Some of the schools who qualified for the funding were voted for closure before the announcement even came out. AVRSB voted to permanently close Annapolis Royal and Newport Station District School on March 22nd. Then this announcement comes on April 11th with no new money. But yet the Newport Station appears on the qualifying list in the press release. Mr. Speaker, this is not the only school slated for closure, which the minister cites as qualifying for this rebranded supplement. This is entirely misleading, and is only meant to help her public relations image. So the question to the minister, why is the minister more interested in public relations than she is in public education?
The honourable member, the honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. School boards identified to me over the course of my mandate around the former HOG formula as being problematic. And the department staff worked with the school boards on 24 different meetings that took a number of months. And we redesigned the funding formula to make sure that we were able to fund the school boards appropriately and in the manner in which they wished. So there is a funding line in the formula now for small isolated schools, and so we listened to the school boards and we worked together, and we now have a revised formula. Thank you.
The honourable member for Yarmouth.
The NDP came to power with much help from students and their parents. The NDP once called for a 10% tuition reduction, rolled back fees, and publicly pondered why Nova Scotia could not have behaved more like Newfoundland and rolled tuition back by more than 22%. Today we learned that Dalhousie University is increasing both its tuition and student fees by 3%, Mr. Speaker. My question to the minister is, will the NDP spoke so loudly about the cost of university in opposition. Why is she governing over a tuition hike today?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Certainly we value our university and community college system in this province. And over the years, we've built up a tremendous high-quality system, but at a cost that Nova Scotians can't afford to sustain into the future. So we sat down with the universities and we co-signed a memorandum of understanding whereby the universities are going to work alongside government to protect their excellence and quality. We put a cap on tuition to protect the affordability and accessibility for students, and we're working in partnership to maintain this system well into the future. Thank you.
The honourable member for Yarmouth on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, what this government fails to realize is that Nova Scotia can't afford to lose more out of its education system.
That's right.
Our future is entirely dependent on how we treat our education system, Mr. Speaker. And this government's decisions are directly responsible for increased cost education in the province. The province's funding cuts to university has caused a $6.9 million shortfall, a shortfall being paid for by students and their families at Dalhousie University. We know that primary to 12 education is not a priority for this government, and now $75 million in post-secondary cuts shows that PSE is not a priority for this government either. My question for the minister is, why is this government actively making decisions that are making a university degree more expensive in this province?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Certainly the evidence when we came into government was that government funding had increased without the accountability mechanisms in place. In fact, between 1999 and 2009, government funding to universities increased by 77%, but enrollments only grew by 13%. So we are trying to manage the system, protect the quality and affordability at a rate that Nova Scotian taxpayers can afford. Thank you.
The honourable member for Yarmouth on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, to chastise previous governments for increasing investment in education is a shameful thing indeed, especially coming from a party who in opposition championed affordable education. I have a quote here from the now Minister of Transportation when he said, "You better guard your wallet, students, because you're going to get whacked." Mr. Speaker, this government continues to make decisions that impact costs associated with post-secondary education and financial pressures on parents and students. My question for the minister is, why, as the transportation minister once accused the Conservative government of doing, is this government intent on whacking post-secondary students and their parents? And I'll table those comments for the House's view.
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very proud to say that we have set aside a sum of $25 million to help our universities look towards an innovative and visionary system in this province. Last year, we provided close to $50 million new dollars for for student assistance and to replace the end of the bursary program, which was the highest single investment in post-secondary education for student assistance in the history of universities. We have capped student debt. We are making a number of significant improvements, and we have committed, we've maintained our commitment to keeping the undergraduate tuition costs for Nova Scotia students and Nova Scotia universities to maintain at or below the national average. All of this in a time of very scarce public dollars. So we are both protecting public taxpayer and we're protecting our university system. Thank you.
The honourable member for Argyll.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As we all know, contract negotiations between the Capital District Health Authority and the NSGU remain stalled. A potential strike by 3,600 vital healthcare support workers, including LPNs, occupational therapists, and medical laboratory technologists, is a week away. People are starting to have their surgeries cancelled, and the health authority is preparing to move as many people out as possible, maybe even before they are ready to go home. Mr. Speaker, how long does the minister think the system can sustain a strike from these very essential healthcare workers?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. And Mr. Speaker, as the Premier said earlier in question period, we are very aware of the situation. We are concerned about the impact that a labour disruption would have on the healthcare system. We recognize that many people are concerned, particularly patients in the system and their families, and we would encourage the parties to get back to the table and work their differences out.
The honourable member for Argyll on his first supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the minister for her answer. But you know, there's 9,000 people already on the surgery wait list. Apparently, 700 surgeries will have to be cancelled each day of the strike. The system itself can't make up for those cancellations without pushing them further and further out. So, my question to the minister is, you know, what's her plan to, outside of just, you know, calling on those parties to get back together, what is she going to do to ensure that those parties get back together?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And it is the case that the Capital District have a plan that they are in the stages of putting into place. It's a plan that is prudent to have and is necessary to have, as we're in a very critical point in the collective bargaining process. And again, I really am not going to insert myself into a process where I encourage the parties to get back to the table and work their differences out.
The Honourable Member for Argyll on his final supplementary.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. This is a matter of lives in some cases, depending on the surgeries that those individuals might require. We all know that healthcare workers are very well represented at the table. The Health Authority is well represented at the table. But the ones that, of course, are left out sort of in that equation is the public. And I think it's the minister's responsibility to protect public. There are all the options, my question to the minister, are all options truly on the table for this minister, including back-to-work legislation, as was suggested in today's Chronicle Herald editorial, which was called health bargaining, public comes first, or is she willing to see a strike go on for days or even weeks before the government takes action?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to assure the member and all members that public safety in the healthcare system is indeed my #1 priority. And again, I am encouraging the parties to settle out their differences through the collective bargaining process. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Yarmouth.
Mr. Speaker, it's not only our universities that are facing increased costs as a result of this government's decisions. The Nova Scotia Community College has laid off 8 college prep coordinators as a result of a $5.37 million budget shortfall as a result of this government's cuts. These coordinators work in junior high schools to encourage students to stay in school, to know their options upon high school graduation, and provide information to students for career planning. This initiative prepared junior and senior high school students for admission to programs at NSCC's 13 campuses, Mr. Speaker. My question for the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education is, if the college prep program has been eliminated, who's going to do this vitally important work in our schools?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to start off by commending the Nova Scotia Community College for taking a very thorough and responsible view in terms of their budget. I'm sure everybody in this chamber agrees that it's an excellent training institution, and it's one whose work and contribution to this province is very much appreciated by all parties and by all citizens. And certainly, I think it's probably been 10 or 12 years since it evolved from the former vocational school system, and it's been doing a tremendous job. Like other service deliverers, the government has asked the community college to look at efficiencies, to continue to review its programs, to look at its administrative costs, and to thoroughly assess what they're doing, how they're doing it, and whether it's relevant and necessary with budget restrictions. And certainly they, I think, have come up with a package that satisfies all those requirements. Thank you.
The honourable member for Yarmouth on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the minister might appreciate the cuts that NCC is being forced to make, but I assure the minister that parents and students don't appreciate how this government is treating the education system in this province. Not only will we not have those incredibly important prep coordinators in our schools anymore, the college will also introduce a $100 student fee to cover things like convocations and ID cards. Mr. Speaker, students and their families are finding it harder to cover the rising cost of education, and still the minister shows no support for core funding to our institutions. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia needs tradespeople, and we need a government who is going to invest in ensuring that Nova Scotians have access to quality trades educations. At a time when our workforce needs tradespeople, why is this minister cutting the budget for Nova Scotia Community College and making it more difficult for students to access these opportunities?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like all government departments, like all third-party service providers across this province, everyone has taken up the challenge of looking for operational efficiencies. At the same time, we realize that new investments need to be made, and certainly we have made an additional investment in the community college that protects the trades and is helping to get Nova Scotians prepared for the economic opportunities that are on our horizon. I don't believe there's any body or institution or organization in Nova Scotia that would not benefit from a review to make sure that what they offer and how they offer it is efficient and effective. And certainly, again, I want to commend the community college for taking a very thorough and professional attitude. And certainly, no reduction or change is a happy occasion for people who are used to that way of doing it. But we have to look to what benefits Nova Scotians, and that certainly is their objective as well as the government's objective. Thank you.
The honourable member for Yarmouth on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, what's confusing to members of this caucus is that at a time of fiscal constraint, when our programs and services are being cut out of our education system, administration costs for the Department of Labour and Advanced Education have increased by 35% in this year's budget, Mr. Speaker. That's what's confusing to this caucus. My question to the minister is, why is the department asking colleges and universities to do more with less when their own administration budget was increased by over 35% this year?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Well, certainly I would be pleased to provide details and an explanation to that during my estimates. But I just want to say at a higher level that I think everyone in this chamber is aware that we've been reorganizing how we deliver services throughout government. Certainly there have been a number of changes and additional responsibilities and reallocation of staff and resources throughout government. Many of them have landed in the Department of Labour and Advanced Education, and certainly I will be able to explain during estimates exactly which changes have taken place. Thank you.
The honourable member for Yarmouth on a new question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Nova Scotia College of Art and Design recently released its response to the Windsor Report and its many recommendations for NASCAD to address its financial concerns. Some of these recommendations include looking to other institutions for possible collaborations and even a potential merger. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education tell members of this House, does the NDP government support an independent NASCAD or not?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Premier and I in our government have been on record for a long time saying that we support NASCAD and we support quality fine arts education in this province. Over the last 2 or 3 years, we've had to invest an extra $6 million in order to allow NASCAD to meet their budget requirements. This is not sustainable. And certainly we've put a number of support measures in place to help the Board of Governors and senior administration look at their budget and try to reframe NASCAD in a way that's affordable, continues to provide quality education, but still is affordable for this province. Thank you.
The honourable member for Yarmouth on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister and the Premier might be on the record supporting NASCAD, but this government's been in place for 3 years and to date has done nothing to address the fundamental issue affecting NASCAD, which is the funding formula. Mr. Speaker, the students and administration of NASCAD have been raising concerns about the funding formula for the university for several years, and still this government has done nothing. If the Minister was so concerned with the future of NASCAD, why did she not act earlier instead of giving the institution a 3-month window to come up with solutions to problems that were years in the making, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government's been working with NASCAD for over 2 years. And I think we're now gradually getting to a point where everyone recognizes that really tough decisions need to be made. The report, sustainability report, was delivered to my office before the end of March. We have staff looking at it very carefully. We are in contact with the NASCAD officials, and we will work alongside them to support them in developing the road ahead. Thank you.
The honourable member for Yarmouth on his final supplementary.
The Minister is still missing the fundamental issue affecting NASCAD, and which would ensure that important institution in this province can remain independent, and that's the funding formula. It doesn't take into consideration the real costs associated with delivering that form of education in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. That's the fundamental problem. And as a result, tuitions will continue to rise at NASCAD, and so will fees. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister tell the students of NASCAD that she will see to it that their tuitions will not go through the roof, that their student fees won't continue to climb, and that their school will be adequately funded by addressing the fundamental issue, and that's the funding formula in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's not one person or one family, one business or one institution in this province that can be given a blank check. And so we are making sure that everything NASCAD needs to do to remain viable, to provide quality fine arts education in this province are in place. We will support them, and that's one reason we've been taking our time to work alongside the Board of Governors and the senior administration. I have confidence that that Board of Governors will make the right decisions and ensure the future of this university. Thank you.
The honourable member for Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal. Mr. Speaker, back in 2010, legislation was passed in this House to require motorists to slow down when passing emergency vehicles stopped on the side of the road. A good bill, Mr. Speaker. However, in order for the law to be effective, Nova Scotians need to know this legislation is in place. So my question to the Minister is, what has the department done to inform Nova Scotians drivers of this new law?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation, Infrastructure Renewal.
I thank the member honestly for that question. It's nice to see that I've been included in the process for a change. Important question, and of course that particular bill, because of the good work of the member from Sackville-Cobequid and how proud we were to bring it forth as our first piece of legislation in preparation for the real issue of educating campaigns when it comes to changes in legislation. This was a question that I had brought to the department's attention when we were looking at this important speed limit that's going to be in school zones. I was informed that $50,000 had been spent on the education campaign for this particular piece of legislation. In addition to that, I'm aware of the fact that this, and I'm going to table this, Mr. Speaker, although this young man was a student of mine, I won't hold it up. I would urge that we now have another reprint of this that's going to become available. I will certainly concur with the member opposite. The education campaign is an important issue. It's a piece of legislation that has to be paid close attention to, and I look forward to your suggestions as we proceed.
The honourable member for Clare on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we continue to hear from Nova Scotians that they don't know this law is in place. Mr. Speaker, shortly after this law was enacted, the Chronicle Herald reported that few vehicles were slowing down to 60 kilometers an hour and obeying the law when passing an emergency vehicle stopped on the side of the road. At the time, Mr. Speaker, only 10% of the more than 150 vehicles that passed by RCMP cruisers slowed down to the required speed limit. I will also table a letter, Mr. Speaker, from the Digby Courier dated January 12, 2012, where a resident was fined because he did not know about the change in legislation and expressed his concern.
Order, please. Oral questions put by members to ministers. The time has expired. I will now recognize the House Leader for the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Love to have heard the answer to that one, too. Can you call private members' public bills for second reading?
Private member public bills for second reading.
Can you call Bill number 27?
Bill number 27, Cyber Bullying Act. I will now recognize the honourable member for Inverness.
Did you want to go first?
Somebody stand up. Thank you. The honourable leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Sorry for the confusion, Mr. Speaker.
That's
okay. I was reluctant to rise until I was sure you were ready for us. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of this bill, and I just want to take a few introductory minutes to explain to the House the inspiration for the bill, at least for me personally, by conveying a few facts about the case of Courtney Brown, a young 17-year-old girl in Parsboro who was the victim of pervasive 24/7 both bullying and cyberbullying in her community, the bullying that all too tragically resulted in her taking her own life. Mr. Speaker, Courtney Brown was bullied by a group of young fellow students on the school grounds of Parsboro High School. She was bullied traveling to and from school off of school property. She was bullied at various locations around the town of Parsboro, all by the same people. And even when she was in the supposed safety of her own home, she was cyberbullied continuously in social media, by text message, on Facebook, and so on. Mr. Speaker, I know that there are some who say that the way to avoid cyberbullying is to simply turn off your cell phone or turn off your laptop. But the fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, for young Nova Scotians today, particularly teenage Nova Scotians, there is a whole conversation with their fellow students that goes on electronically that you are then telling them to no longer be a part of, which is a great unfairness to the victims of cyberbullying. The lessons from the story of Courtney Brown, Mr. Speaker, are that it takes everybody in a community to protect our children from